Should men refuse to be alone with female colleagues? The moral answer to such a question is none of my business. It's up for the individuals to negotiate these things, followed maybe by a personal policy on that if you have one. Now, I do have one, but many people don't. However, in the minds of the increasingly unintelligent and formerly sane and currently a vehicle for social justice communism over at the Harvard Business Review, the answer to that question has changed. Nowadays, the HBR purports to know what all men should do. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, on one hand I was mildly annoyed by the fact that Mike Pence's comments from 14 years ago became international headlines all of a sudden a while ago, but on the other hand, when that happened I was very busy and couldn't make a video in time as the controversy was rolling. But then again, I'm not known to jump on a controversy right on and rather prefer to be picky about the topics. And if I choose a controversy, I'll take the wait-and-see approach before uttering a word about it. That is a policy that has spared me the trouble of having said something on a whim that I regretted just a few days later. Thankfully, though, the Harvard Business Review decided to reignite the story, which gives me a very good opportunity to both rip into this disdainful outlet and make some not exactly kosher arguments. So get ready, because this is going to get long. So, the Harvard Business Review titles Men Shouldn't Refuse to Be Alone with Female Colleagues by W. Brad Johnson and David G. Smith, because it takes two idiots to write this crap. The article is quite long, but we'll go through all of it because this kind of lunacy does need to be thoroughly debunked. And it goes like this, quote, when U.S. Vice President Mike Pence said that he would never have a meal alone with a woman who was not his wife, he was invoking the well-worn Billy Graham rule, and the evangelical leader has famously urged male leaders to, quote, avoid any situation that would have even the appearance of compromise or suspicion. Translation, men should avoid spending time alone with women to whom they are not married. Graham has been known to avoid not only meals, but also car and even elevator rides with a woman. The reason? To avoid tarnishing his reputation by either falling prey to sexual temptation or inviting gossip about impropriety. Think Pence's quarantine of women is unique? Consider a recent survey by National Journal in which multiple women employed as congressional staffers reported and male colleagues confirmed the existence of an implicit policy that only male staffers could spend time one-on-one or at after-hours events with their male congressmen. Cut out of key conversations, networking opportunities, professional exposure, and face time with career influencers, female staffers naturally are underrepresented in leadership positions and, not surprisingly, earn about $6,000 less annually than their male peers. Okay, so? No, seriously, so what? Even if all of that were true, which I don't believe for a second, since I'm not in the business of believing the National Journal, but even if all of that were true, it would still not be an issue. This is something that most people will have to relearn, and they will relearn much faster than many dare to imagine right now. Freedom of association includes freedom of disassociation. If I don't want to hang out with you, I will not hang out with you. And whatever you're losing from that decision is none of my business, and there is nothing you can do about it. I mean, really, what are they gonna do? Force male staffers to invite the girls out too? Ban the after-hours hanging out at the bar? Well, actually, there is a loon who proposed that. His name is Jeremy Corbyn. Soon enough, we'll see that particular stance tested in a general election, but allow me to predict right now, right from the get-go, that this doesn't bode well with the electorate. But in any event, Corbyn's explicit argument that drinks after work are unfair to women and should thus be banned, and the Harvard Business Review and National Journal's implicit argument for the exact same position suffers from the exact same problem. It is a retarded position to take, not to mention an immoral position, an unpopular position, and very likely coming from a position of personality disorder, possibly NPD. Those suffering from narcissistic personality disorder tend to be the most vocal about their right to someone else's time and company. Anyway, let's read further. Quote, "The Billy Graham and now Mike Pence rule is wrong on nearly every level. Lauded by some as an act of male chivalry, it is merely a 20th century American iteration of sex segregation. When women are in effect quarantined, banned from solitary meetings with male leaders, including prospective sponsors and career champions, their options for advancement, let alone professional flourishing, shrink. The more that men quarantine women, excluding them from key meetings, after-hours networking events, and one-on-one coaching and mentoring, the more that men will be the ones securing C-suite jobs. The preservation of men and the exclusion of women from leadership roles will be perpetuated everywhere that the Billy Graham rule is practiced. Score another one for the Old Boys Club." Again, even if that were true, so what? The fact of the matter is that it isn't true, because if it were true, there would be no female CEOs with big contracts, women wouldn't be the main driver of consumer spending, and wouldn't be the majority of students in universities. But again, even if it were true, it would still not be an issue. Through such a policy, which again, it's adopted individually, not collectively, and I know this is a hard one for progressives to grasp, but please give it a try. Through such a policy, the individual men following it are also in effect quarantined, banned from solitary meetings with female leaders, including prospective sponsors and career champions. Their options for advancement, let alone professional flourishing, also do shrink. It takes two to the tango, comrade. And again, if people were to act as collectives, the way these two idiots who wrote this article seem to believe, then it stands to reason that if women as a whole are really that affected by this, newsflash, they're not, but for the sake of the argument, if women as a whole are so affected by this and men and women act as collectives, as the premise goes, then it stands to reason that the best course of action is for women to compete with similar structures. And mind you, some feminists actually did try that. They created their own companies in which they actively discriminated against men. Their companies were a spectacular failure. All of them. As it turns out, all-women work environments are nowhere near as successful as the all-male work environments. This should, of course, suggest biology, but this is the Harvard Business Review under the auspices of the Harvard University. That would be the same mental asylum that fired its chairman for daring to suggest that biology might play a role when it comes to men's and women's achievements in mathematics. So we shouldn't expect reason from such a place, because there is none. And here's something hard for progressives to swallow. In some fields, women will always be a minority, not because of the Graham rule, but because there are fields for which women simply can't cut the mustard. What's far more interesting is that the folks who are the most offended by this are exactly the same folks who would put you in jail if they had this power for daring to say anything about Islam, which is a culture that actually does practice sex segregation as an absolute mandate, as opposed to the Western culture, which doesn't. But anyway, let's read further. Quote, "Whether codified or informal, sex quarantines are rooted in fear. At the heart of it, policies curbing contact between men and women at work serve to perpetuate the notions that women are toxic temptresses who want to either seduce powerful men or falsely accuse them of sexual harassment. This framing allows men to justify their anxiety about feeling attracted to women at work and sometimes their own sexual boundary violations. It also undermines the perceived validity of claims by women who have been harassed or assaulted. Although thoughtful professional boundaries create the bedrock for trust, collegiality, and the kind of non-sexual intimacy that undergirds the best mentoring relationships, fear-based boundaries are different. By reducing or even eliminating cross-sex social contact, sex segregation prevents the very exposure that reduces anxiety and builds trust. Really? Really? You guys are about 25 years too late to this argument, darling. Non-feminists, including leftist non-feminists such as Warren Farrell, have been making this argument since 1992 and used it to argue against the insane sexual harassment policies that have plagued most of the corporate world in both North America and Europe, though it can be argued that this lunacy did hit America much harsher than it hit Europe. In France, for instance, you can be accused of sexual harassment if a woman says that she felt unsafe when you looked at her. And even if you have video footage that shows that nothing really happened, that may still not be enough, because if she says she felt harassed, then that is a priori the legal truth and determines guilt. So under these conditions, you will excuse me if I don't give a flying toss about what career opportunities the poor little women might lose out on because men working in France might even individually decide that being in the same room with a female colleague is simply not worth it at all and thus avoid doing that altogether. I know I wouldn't. One single allegation can mean 30,000 euros in fines and up to 3 years in jail. Whereas not being alone with a woman that's not my wife can, at its worst, mean that some idiots will call me a sexist on the internet and in disdainful rags such as the Harvard Business Review. Yeah, I'll take the name-calling by the people whose opinions I don't respect in the return to preserving my own liberty. Thank you very much. But okay, France is an extreme example for sure. But the fact of the matter is that most HR departments have all sorts of paralegal, bizarre policies that essentially presume a man to be automatically guilty because some random cunt claims she's been harassed. Just Google false sexual harassment accusations workplace and start reading. Sure, we can argue that not all women do that. In fact, I absolutely do agree that the overwhelming majority of women never did this and will never do it. I can also agree that occasionally men falsely accuse women of harassment in the workplace. But the fact of the matter is that most sexual harassment policies in most corporate workplaces, especially in America, are either coded or informally geared towards presuming women to be always victims and men to be always guilty even before either the man or the woman even opened their mouths. It just pays to be a victim, and under such a system of incentives, it is obvious for most men and most women that the environment is toxic. That's why outside ideologically driven circles such as the Harvard Business Review, a significant chunk of women also do understand why men do things the way they do. Americans even have an acronym for it. It's the CYA, or the Cover Your Ass policy. And that's not going to change anytime soon, as long as women have legal privileges over men through policies, regulations, and laws that essentially cripple men of their due process rights in such instances. And when you have a system on top of the already adversarial and lawsuit-happy culture that is far more prevalent in the US than it is in Europe, expect things to get even worse for you feminists, and not better. That's why things like Women Against Feminism are important, because for as long as this marginal, minuscule minority of bigots who adhere to feminism are allowed to dictate or influence policy, everyone will be worse off. Anyway, let's read further. Quote, To build closer, anxiety-free working relationships with members of the opposite sex, thoughtful men will be well served by having more, not less, interaction with women at work. In a classic series of studies, psychologist Robert Zions discovered that repeated exposure to a stimulus, such as a gender group, that previously elicited discomfort and anxiety helped reduce anxiety and actually increase the probability of fondness and positive interaction. Termed the mere exposure effect in social psychology, the principle has been particularly useful in changing negative attitudes about previously stigmatized groups. Excellent leaders initiate positive developmental and collegial interactions with as many types of people as they can, deliberately, frequently, and transparently. And here is the progressive misandrist spin. The assumption that men that employ such policies to themselves aren't thoughtful. The reality is exactly the reverse from what these idiots are describing. Very few men find it easy or desirable to make a conscious choice to stay away from being alone with the opposite sex in the work environment. That is, by definition, a process that follows a previous thought pattern. So it is the men that do adopt these policies for themselves as individuals that are the thoughtful ones, whereas those who ignore the clear and present danger of false allegations are the ones who are not thoughtful at all, or even worse, are aware of the danger and disregard it, thinking that it cannot happen to them. And here, maybe I should share a story. Look, I used to work, in fact, I worked for a multinational conglomerate for a while. I still work with them sometimes, but now I work with them and not for them. The distinction it matters quite a lot. Contractors deal with the executives directly, whereas employees are forced to go through the cancer, that is, the cunt department, sometimes known as the HR or the Human Resources Bureau. While I worked there as an employee in my department, there were 6 dudes, including myself, and 5 dudettes. I was the only dude who employed this policy after observing everyone and decided that 2 of the dudettes were definitely trustworthy and worth my time. One of the dudettes was insipid, and the remaining 3 were definitely crazy and should be kept as far away as possible. The other dudes thought I was the crazy one for my discreet yet unrelenting policy. Until 3 of them got fired over bullshit harassment cases filed exactly by the 3 cunts that I had identified as crazy and dangerous. Then they started believing me, although for 3 of them was a little bit too late. Heck, in one of the 3 cases, I was not only there when the alleged harassment had happened, but there was comprehensive video evidence too. None of that mattered because the HR's overarching policy of avoiding the appearance of impropriety was paramount. Now, while I do blame the miserable cunts for the HR for being, well, miserable cunts, I also do understand the company's overall point of view. But here's the catch. That is another reason for men to adopt the Mike Pence policy. I was avoiding the 3 crazies for the exact same reason, to avoid any appearance of impropriety. If I've never been in a room alone with you, and every time you were in the same room with me there's video footage and at least 2 witnesses, and the possibility of a fake allegation going through is much, much lower than if I were to listen to disdainful ideologues such as the authors of this article. Now, another disingenuous aspect of this paragraph is the quoting of Robert Zions' research for a case that it doesn't apply to. Zions' research is about stimuli that elicits discomfort and anxiety for reasons of fear of the unknown, for irrational reasons, or for reasons impossible to assess. None of that applies here. The Mike Pence rule does emerge from a very rational concern and has nothing to do with fear of the unknown. If anything, it's precisely the fear of something that is very well known to happen. The mere exposure effect is irrelevant to this discussion, but you would have only known this if you had, asked some real-life flesh and blood men about it. But instead of doing that, you asked each other in your ever-shrinking far leftist bubble and concluded that the only reason one might employ the Mike Pence rule for himself is because one doesn't know how women look like and haven't been exposed to women and are thus irrationally fearful of them. Newsflash, kids. Women are half of the population. The rationale used on tiny minorities doesn't work with large swaths of the population. Anyway, let's read further. Quote, perhaps the most disingenuous and deceptive quality of the Billy Graham rule and other forms of sex segregation at work may be their superficially honorable and chivalrous nature. This benevolent sexism includes evaluations of women that appear subjectively positive but are quite damaging to gender equity. In their pioneering research on the topic, psychologists Peter Glick and Susan Fisk discovered that women often endorse many benevolent forms of sexism, such as that women are delicate and require protection, or that sex quarantines at work help preserve women's reputations, despite the fact that the sexism inhibits real gender equality. This may explain why many women applauded Pence's stance as evidence of his character and commitment to his marriage, but sexism always diminishes and disadvantages women at work. Even benevolent sexist policies which lack transparent hostility and appear nice on the surface lead to lower rates of pay and promotion, regardless of how many women support them. So basically, these two progressive cucks are going to mansplain to everyone what women actually need. I mean, seriously, that's basically what they're saying. That women applauding Pence for his stance are actually too dumb to know what's best for them, and thankfully, the two white knights from Harvard Business Review are here to enlighten them. This is much closer to elitist patriarchy, the way your sorry lot defines it, than anything Mike Pence has ever done or said. Mike Pence doesn't assume to know what's best for all women, or for all men for that matter. He just assumes to know what's best for him and his family and adapted his conduct accordingly. Your sorry lot, on the other hand, assumes to know what's best for all women and assume to know what men should and shouldn't do, as if anyone ever asked your opinion about it. Anyway, the next paragraph is long, so we'll dissect it by phrases. Quote, here is something most men fail to consider when invoking sex quarantines at work. What does their unwillingness to be seen alone with a woman say about them and males more generally? Here's something for you to consider. Why should men care? More particularly, why should men care what you and your misandrist lot think about them? They cared for 40 to 50 years and it has gotten them zero benefits, more responsibilities, and far, far less rewards for all that burden. Maybe, just maybe, it's about bloody time men stop giving a shit about what you believe, or what anyone else's believes for that matter. And this is well on its way to happening already, and it's much easier with men than it is with women, because as a rule, men already don't give a shit about men in general. Now that usually has bad consequences, but in this instance it actually has a very good one. It makes them immune to such shaming bollocks. Quote, when a man refuses to be alone with a female colleague on a car trip or in a restaurant owing to fear of something untoward happening, we must ask, dude, do you or do you not have a functioning frontal lobe? Well, having a functioning frontal lobe is absolutely necessary to reach to the conclusion that the risks outweigh any potential benefits. So the question is really, do these authors have a functioning frontal lobe? Because judging by this writing, the answer appears to be a resounding no. Quote, Sex quarantines reinforce notions that men are barely evolved sex maniacs, scarcely capable of muting, let alone controlling their evolved neurological radar for fertile mates of the opposite sex. Sex quarantines paint men as impulsive, sexually preoccupied, and unable to refrain from consummating romantic interests or sexual feelings if they occur in cross-sex relationships. Close quote. Well, perhaps. It's not always the case, but let's assume this is 100% of the times the case. Well, so what? I mean, feminists have been busy demonizing men everywhere by doing exactly that, painting them as barely evolved sex maniacs, impulsive, sexually preoccupied, and unable to refrain from consummating romantic interest or sexual feelings. What do you think all men are rapists is about, you blathering imbeciles? Quote, the sex-crazed male stereotype is often reinforced in the process of male socialization, and there are plenty of men who, at least on some level, fear breaking rank and violating these expectations of male behavior. Close quote. Yeah, that's pure, unadulterated lunacy. Nothing whatsoever to do with reality. Breaking rank? Really? I mean, not even Sharia law has such a tight or rigid type of socialization. Give me a fucking break. Quote, this is where moral courage comes in. The fact is, many men choose not to fulfill this stereotype. Many men have close, mutual, collegial relationships with women and never once violate a relational boundary. Close quote. And this, my fellow deplorables, is called a false dichotomy. There are slightly more options out there than either being a sex-crazed maniac or being a leftist white knight simp who sucks up to all women and falls prey to the very known and documented phenomenon in psychology, the women are wonderful effect, that is, and putting yourself in great danger in the process. These aren't the only two options by any means, not to mention that very few men fit into any of these two options. Very few people, men or women, are so mentally castrated as to leave their entire safety and livelihood rely on the fact that all women are great. And those that do that, they tend to bear the brunt of learning the truth the hard way. All throughout this article, both authors ignore, perhaps purposefully, the realities on the ground which are radically different than what they imagine. Because this is really what this is, imagination from these authors. The world that they describe is not even a caricature of reality, it is outright fiction. Quote, of course, the Billy Graham rule and other efforts at quarantining women suffer from a number of logical inconsistencies. For instance, there is the efficacy problem. Rigid efforts to eliminate cross-sex interaction in the workplace have not proven effective. Even in the most conservative religious denominations, nearly one-third of pastors have crossed sexual boundaries with parishioners. Well, citation needed. Besides, nobody, except you, speaks about strict rigidity. Even Mike Pence is more flexible than you are, and he's living with the policy, whereas you are only analyzing. So under normal circumstances, if you were a normal person, not a mentally disordered progressives, apologies for the pleonasm, you would be inclined to include variables and flexibility. Also, why exactly are you mixing up churches with workplaces? Please, don't move the goalposts, you disdainful and disingenuous prick. Knuckleheads. Anyway, quote, then there is the uncomfortable truth that the Billy Graham rule denies the reality of LGBT people and that sexual and romantic feelings are not limited to cross-sex relationships. The logic of sex quarantine thinking would dictate that a bisexual leader could never meet alone with anyone, close quote. No, it wouldn't. And here's why. Nobody really cares about the LGBT, as it should. The LGBT should never ever have been allowed to dictate policy on anything. Besides, having people not giving a shit about you is far better than any alternative, believe me. And again, any rule or policy is first and foremost thought about with the realities of the overwhelming majority in mind. Only in progressive La La Land is this framework of thinking fashionable, the framework that starts with the absolute exception, the infinitesimal minority, and then develop policy starting from there, thus enacting a de facto dictatorship of the minority. That is not how real life works, honey. Quote, finally, the truth is that sex-excluding policies are rooted in deeply erroneous dichotomous thinking. Either I engage with women at work and risk egregious, career-threatening boundary violations, or I avoid all unchaperoned interaction with women, close quote. Well, that's rich, coming from the authors that committed the logical fallacy of a false dichotomy at least twice in this article up to this point. But no, some things in life are dichotomous. You're either pregnant or you're not. You can't be partially pregnant. And I agree that severing all interactions with women at work is an extreme position, but it is an extreme position that exists as a very sane reaction to a highly extremist status quo. And until the status quo changes, such a reaction will be more and more common. Quote, so what's an evolved male leader to do? In the simplest terms, become what we call a thoughtful caveman, close quote. So what's an evolved female leader to do? In the simplest terms, become what we call a thoughtful whore, or a thoughtful cunt. Here, I'll call on Olavo de Carvalho's principle. Your mother is a caveman, you fucking degenerate. Quote, healthy, mature, self-aware men understand and accept their distinctly male neural architecture. If they happen to be heterosexual, this means they own the real potential for cross-sex attraction without catastrophizing this possibility or acting out feelings of attraction to the detriment of female colleagues. Thoughtful cavemen employ their frontal cortex to ensure prudence and wise judgment in relationships with women and men. If they happen to be heterosexual, go suck a bag of dicks, you pretentious moron. Good luck with this pitch to the increasing number of men and the minority of women who've been screwed over by false allegations and who'd wish they had employed the Mike Pence rule. And finally, the last and the most offensive paragraph, quote, here is a final reason why even devoutly Christian men like Mike Pence and Billy Graham should be dubious about isolating and excluding women at work. Jesus himself was known to meet alone with women, e.g. when the Samaritan woman at the well. It seems that showing kind hospitality and elevating the dignity of women was more important than any threat of gossip. Here's the thing. You are basically doing what you're accusing Mike Pence of doing. The difference is that Mike Pence isn't doing what you think he's doing. But you are. Mike Pence doesn't try to use scripture to even provide advice, let alone enact policy on this issue. He never said all men should do like him. He didn't even impose it on his own staff. He only imposed it upon himself based on his belief and interpretation of Scripture. Now, you may disagree with his interpretation of the Scripture, though you would absolutely be wrong in doing so, but to claim he should be dubious about his interpretation because you say so is showing the authoritarian tendencies in these two authors. More to the point, and this is the atheist speaking, this is essentially blasphemy. Blasphemy is not making fun of Jesus, but blasphemy is first and foremost using scripture to argue that God's will coincides with your own will, thus substituting yourself for God. You know what they say about atheists knowing more about religion than many religious people? Well, it's at least in part true. Here's some more wisdom from this atheist. Jesus was essentially the bringer of the New Testament, but also saying that he is there to uphold the law. That would be the Old Testament. In any event, in the New Testament, there is a command for the believers. In the first epistle to the Thessalonians, verses 20 to 23, and a bit beyond that actually, are explicitly New Testament commands to the Christian way of life. How to live as a Christian. Specifically, verses 20 to 22 go like this. Do not treat prophecies with contempt, but test all things. Hold fast to what is good. Abstain from every form of evil. Close quote. The last verse is the one that Mike Pence is abiding by. So not only Jesus and his law doesn't say what these authors claim it says, but it actually says the exact opposite of what these authors say. This is a clear case of blasphemy. Now, I am an atheist and not a fan of theocracies, but it is cunts like these two authors that probably should get a proverbial kick in the teeth for trying to muddy the waters to suit their agenda. More to the point, this author tries to do what only young earth creationists are doing, trying to apply the letter of the scripture for a situation that is rather new. Yeah, sure, Jesus wasn't very concerned with the threat of gossip, but then again, Jesus lived around 2,000 years ago when the concept of office gossip was a bit different. And most importantly, the concept of sexual harassment policies was also very different. So was the very concept of a workplace. And speaking of which, you're quoting an episode where Jesus met alone with a woman outside of the workplace. So not only you're trying to apply the letter of the scripture to modern situations, just like the young earth creationists are doing, but you're also applying a portion that doesn't fit at all with what you're describing, even if I were to buy into your primitive narrative of Bible literalism. And this is why I'm using more and more often terms like the religious left, because the left is a religion in itself, and in its pure form is in no way different than young earth creationism and other forms of biology denialist ideologies from which mainstream Christianity distanced itself centuries ago. The left, in its almost 2 centuries of existence, in spite of its advantage of coming of age in a much more developed world than Christianity, which actually had to build some of that developed world, in spite of all these, mainstream leftism is still much more backwards than first century Christianity in many respects, especially on the topic of biology and interhuman relationships. Now, let's be clear. I regard it as a very sad state of affairs that in many countries it is far safer for men to adopt Mike Pence-like rules for themselves, but trying to deny the state of affairs and do the standard feminist thing, which is to blame it all again on men, is not only disingenuous, but it's not forwarding the discussion at all. You know what would forward the discussion? Naming and shaming the false accusers, regardless of their sex, because again, sometimes men use this tool too, although far less successfully, because the overall consensus and impetus is to always believe the woman. You know what else would forward the discussion? The acknowledgement that women are adults. That means they are not wonderful. Nor are they inherently evil. They're just adult people, just like the rest of us, which means they are flawed. They sometimes do wonderful things. They most of the times do mediocre things, and they sometimes do very messed up things. You know, just like the rest of us. Now that would forward the discussion. But until that point is reached, nothing will change. The status quo will get worse and worse progressively, like a disease, and correspondingly men will innovate new and more ways to avoid having to go through the grinder. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support, and I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.